Hi, and welcome back to the ghbond channel. I didn't have a video scheduled for tonight, but keeping up with Richard Heart has been a real chore lately because he's everywhere, and lo and behold, he referenced a video that I had in production. Now that video was unfinished, and I'd sort of shelved it to get back to maybe in a month or so, but since he mentioned it in his interview with David Gokhshtein, and I've probably slaughtered his name just like Richard did, but I broke it up for you there in case you want to search it and watch that video. The GOK, HSH, and the TEIN. So that's how you spell it if you want to search it out on Twitter. Anyway, Richard Heart during this video said that HEX should just be made the world's reserve currency. And that's exactly the topic of this video. So I dusted it off and I'm going to finish it and share it with the world. So let's get to it. In this video, we're going to discuss HEX as the new world reserve currency. Now that may sound ridiculous to you, but little do you know that a friend of a friend speaks directly to Barack Obama. And guess what? They're never going to get their way out of inflation with the US dollar. So HEX is their only shot. So maybe it's not as far-fetched as you may think. So for this video, just like watching a superhero video, I want you to suspend your disbelief for a little while and open your mind to the possibility. And we're going to take a look at HEX and how it compares to the US dollar and some of the pluses and minuses of both currencies. And then in the end, we're going to go back to the real world. And I've got a few Twitter posts and we're going to take those on one at a time so that you'll understand both sides of the argument. This is a video where I'm going to educate you, but I can't tell you whether it's right for you to invest in HEX. I can tell you that I own some. And I can also tell you, like any crypto, it's extremely risky. And the possibility of it going to zero always exists. So with that warning, let's get to it. Here we have a chart that compares both forms of money. On the left, we have the basic HEX tokenomics, and on the right, we have the US dollar economics. Let's talk about the US dollar first because we're, in general, a little bit more familiar with that. Now, everybody knows about the US Fed and the money printer. Money printer is what allowed us to buy so much cryptocurrency to begin with because it created a large flood of money right after the COVID disaster. With the US dollar, there are various places where people can deposit their bags of US dollars, and some of them might be banks or brokers or investment firms. The US Federal Reserve, on the other hand, has the dual mandate of first keeping inflation under control, whatever that is, and second, helping to keep the economy on an even keel. As we all know right now, they're more interested in taming inflation than they are in the economy. So the problem with the US Federal Reserve is that they generate inflation, they add money to the money supply, but we never know how much they're going to add. For the 2 years, 2020 and 2021, they added about 12% per year, which is an incredible amount of inflation. And over here, what do they use the inflation for? Well, besides stimulating the economy, they use it to pay the U.S. debt. They use it for our unfunded liabilities, Social Security and Medicare. And of course, the piggies in Congress spend it like it's going out of style. They don't seem to worry anymore too much about funding, although now they've suddenly realized that when you spend money like a drunken sailor, it creates inflation. And they're starting to get responsible because, after all, they need to be reelected. So let's talk about HEX tokenomics. HEX tokenomics, when you enter the HEX world, you can do two things with your HEX tokens. One, you can put them in your Ethereum or your PulseChain wallet. Now, most of you have heard of Ethereum. PulseChain is a new blockchain that's been created by Richard Heart because Ethereum was slow and expensive, and he wanted his HEX token to be able to be traded on a faster, less costly blockchain. So that blockchain hasn't been launched yet, but when it does, I expect a lot of the HEX traffic will go towards PulseChain. The other thing you can do is stake your tokens. If you stick your token in the wallet, it just sits there. It'll sit there for the next 20 years. If you put it into the HEX money printer, it's a little bit different. The actual HEX gets burnt. Now, what does burnt means? Burnt means that the HEX tokens disappear and are no longer in the circulating supply. The HEX money printer has a fixed amount of inflation, Every year, 3.69% inflation is generated on the entire HEX supply. That means the burn tokens and the tokens in wallets. That 3.69% inflation is paid out to the people who stake. Now, there's a lot of people staking, so how do we split up the 3.69% inflation? Well, that's calculated each day based on the share of the stake by age. Earlier stakes get bigger shares. The length of the stake, the longer you stake, the bigger the share you get. And the size of the stake, the more you stake, the more you get. Now, these are all defined further, but we're not going to get into them in a lot of detail. I'll just give you an example that my 2-year stake pays about 16%. The largest stakes get up near 40%. At the end of your stake, it's your responsibility to go to the money printer and print your coins. So you get a small bag going in and a larger bag coming back out. It's a larger bag because it has both your original hex and the new hex that you've minted. Now, where does that hex come from? Just like the U.S. Federal Reserve, the money machine prints it. So if you look on the HEX website, it's talking about earning a yield. That yield is actually inflation. That yield comes from the HEX money printer and comes back with your original stake into your bag. And then typically people stake over again unless they need the money. As long as you don't need the money, it makes sense to have it earning the inflation. Any questions? Put them down in the comments, and let's go on to a little bit more in-depth comparison now. Now we'll look a little bit deeper at the comparison between the US dollar and HEX. The areas we're going to review are inflation, security, efficiency, and value. Let's get to it. Now let's talk about inflation of supply. Inflation of supply is slightly different than the inflation that you've been hearing about on the news. The inflation you've been hearing out in the news is price inflation, but what we're comparing is inflation in the supply of money. In HEX, as we've discussed, it's fixed at 3.69% each year. So at the end of the year, there will be 3.69% more HEX than there was last year. With the US dollar, it's random. It's one of the problems with the US dollar. You want it to be the world's reserve currency. Well, let's say you're planning for a child's college education 15 years in the future. If you don't know how much the inflation is going to be, how are you supposed to save? Now, of course, the Federal Reserve has a target where they'd like to see inflation, but meanwhile, you don't know where it's going to be. So about the best you can do is plan to save more than you expected to. And of course, you're going to have to save more also, you already know, because due to that inflation, the price is going to go up dramatically from here before your son or daughter gets to school. Next, we want to discuss security. But before we discuss security, I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of having cryptocurrency in the first place. And the best place to understand the original intent is to go back to Satoshi's white paper. I'm now going to read a small section of that white paper to you so that you can understand the real purpose of cryptocurrency. Completely non-reversible transactions are not really possible since financial institutions cannot avoid mediating disputes. This is like when you dispute something on your credit card. The cost of mediation increases transaction costs, limiting the minimum practical transaction size and cutting off the possibility for small casual transactions, and there is a broader cost in the loss of ability to make non-reversible payments for non-reversible services. With the possibility of reversal, meaning that the customer, the purchasing person, reverses the charge on the supplier or vendor, merchants must be wary of their customers. The need for trust spreads. Merchants must be wary of their customers, hassling them for more information than they would otherwise need. What is needed is an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party. So Bitcoin, which was the root of all cryptocurrencies, was created to allow people to transact directly between each other without the need for somebody in the middle. So how does that affect security? Well, we're familiar with the dollar. An institution of some kind holds it for you, but that institution could be in trouble. It could go bankrupt. We've seen failures of multiple institutions in the cryptocurrency area lately, and it can happen as well to banks holding US dollars. Since the 2008 crisis, a new type of resolution to institutions in crisis has been developed called bail-ins. What happens with a bail-in? Most institutions that you would put your dollars in, you're going to have FDIC insurance, which insures your $500,000 worth, depending on the type of account. Now we can do a bail-in, so anything beyond that amount is used as part of the money necessary to resolve the financial situation of the institution. The other thing that can happen with a dollar is obviously it can be inflated without you having any control over it or the ability to share in the inflation. And it can be seized. If you didn't pay attention, the truckers in Canada actually were having their bank accounts frozen. So if your politics isn't right, that money can be accessed by the government. Another thing not related to the dollar that a lot of people don't know, that in a previous crisis, the US government made gold ownership illegal and drained all the gold from safety deposit box holders, paying them what they thought was a fair amount for it. So the US dollar, despite being the world's reserve currency, isn't 100% secure. HEX, however, is secure on the blockchain. As long as you have the keys, nobody else can get to it. And there's no counterparty risk. You are actually on the physical ledger. There's no way for the government to go in there and take your money as you have the keys. And there's no counterparty risk. There's no bank. When I first started looking at gaining yield, I noticed HEX had yield, and I also noticed I could get yield from Celsius. So I did some of both. Fortunately, I got most of my money out of Celsius before it was an issue, and the rest I got out just in time thanks to Richard Hart, the founder of HEX, because Richard put out a warning on Twitter that Celsius was about to go under. When you keep your tokens on chain and you use a wallet to view them, they're safe. When you give your tokens to somebody else and they lend them out to risky lenders, they're not safe. As soon as you go with an exchange, you no longer have the keys to your cryptocurrency. Somebody else does. And you just hope they give it back to you. And as we've seen in the case of Celsius, those people don't have their money back yet. So in summary, holding HEX secure on chain with a wallet viewer is the safest money ever invented. Now let's have a look at efficiency. And what do I mean by efficiency? Well, it should be self-evident. When you use HEX, you go directly from customer to merchant, and it's recorded on chain. There are no extra costs. The money's transferred directly, the chain charges for the transaction, and that's it. The dollar, we have multiple transactions. Your money goes from you to the bank. The bank, of course, has their own fees and charges. From the bank, it goes to the credit card company when you spend it, and the credit card company takes 1.5% to 3.5% charge from the merchant for the services of doing the credit card transaction. Then it goes to the merchant's bank, and the merchant may have to pay a fee to keep their account open, and they have their own fees. So let's compare the value of the US dollar to the value of HEX. Now, we all know the US dollar is the strongest currency on earth. It's the world's reserve, and it may not be tied to gold anymore, but it's tied to oil. You may have heard the term petrodollar, and that means that all oil transactions are done in US dollars, which means that everybody needs US dollars. Of course, recently, Russia's been trying to get them done in rubles, but the petrodollar is still hanging in there, and the dollar is a very powerful currency to be reckoned with. However, as we all know, it has uncontrolled inflation. The government can print as much as they want, making it less valuable. And also, because of this easy abuse by government, The trend for all fiat currencies that are backed by nothing is basically to eventually become worthless. They go to zero. HEX, on the other hand, has a market value. It's determined by the marketplace. Currently, its value is tied to adoption, meaning the more people who enter the HEX universe, the higher its value becomes, similar to Bitcoin. And since so much of it is in the original OA wallet, in theory, once HEX got big enough as the world's reserve currency, the OA wallet could be used as a buffer to actually drive the value of HEX up or down to make it stay more consistent with existing commodities that it was being used to pay for. If you've never done it before, you might want to pay a visit to usdebtclock.org and take a look at all of the data that's continually displayed and updated there. Just take a look at not only our national debt, but our unfunded liability, which is the amounts that relate to our Medicare and our Social Security that we've promised to pay, but we definitely don't have the money to pay. And then look at our population and realize that as our massive debts grow, we can certainly eventually never repay them, and politicians will take the easy way out and they will print the money. Now let's take a look at some friendly Twitter posts that I got lately in response to some of the things that I said about HEX. All smart people know that HEX is a scam and a Ponzi. Well, a smart person would know that a Ponzi requires that new investors' coins or tokens are taken to pay off the yield from old investors. That absolutely does not happen, because if you put, as a new investor, your money in your wallet, your HEX will stay there forever. None of it will ever be taken to pay off old investors. So by definition, it is not a Ponzi. A scam means that somebody's trying to fool somebody. All the information about how HEX works is readily available. No one's ever been scammed. There are no complaints about it being a scam, other than what people say baselessly to try and attack HEX, because for whatever reason they've decided that they don't like it. Next one is, where's the value? What work is being done? There's nothing to figure out about HEX except that it's a scam and a Ponzi. Well, here we go, repeating the same tired argument. What work is being done? I guess it depends what you mean by work. If you want to equate the Bitcoin value to electricity, that's a wonderful thought. However, solving pointless equations does not create value. What creates value is the market. And if at some point people decide that creating massive computer banks to solve pointless equations is a crime against the earth, Bitcoin may just be socially canceled. Here's another quote. This individual has the mistaken idea that somehow 38% more HEX is inflated every year. As we've already discussed, the figure is 3.69% of the HEX supply is the inflation. Obviously, they don't understand HEX. Here's a criticism that's not a criticism. Smart people understand that yield you speak of is merely inflation of a quote-unquote valueless token. Well, the US dollar is valueless also. In an emergency, I would rather have food, water, or shelter versus paper currency from the United States. In the case of HEX, or in the case of the US dollar, the value is exactly what we decide it's worth. This all really comes down to a vote. If you had a real choice between having the US dollar and its unlimited inflation controlled by politicians, or HEX with its 3.69% guaranteed annual inflation, your ability to actually participate in earning that inflation, and no ability of politicians to just print more on a whim, which would you choose? Unfortunately, we don't have that choice yet, but you got to start somewhere. And finally, my favorite one, and finally, my very favorite. Let me guess, you're going to tell me that a valueless token compares favorably to the world's reserve currency. Yes, I think that's exactly what I just did. Till next time, this is ghbond saying, fight for the best currency you can possibly have.